Welcome to the Dark Ledger, where history's darkest secrets are finally revealed. In 1835, Alexandria was a city that appeared calm on the surface, its cobblestone streets busy with carts, sailors, merchants, and the steady rhythm of port life. Yet beneath that ordinary movement lay a system built on human suffering so normalized that it rarely drew a second glance. The Potomac River carried ships heavy with tobacco, grain, and enslaved people, and near the dock stood holding houses where men, women, and children were confined before being auctioned south. These buildings were unremarkable to white residents: brick walls, barred windows, thick doors reinforced with iron, but for those trapped inside, they were places where time slowed into dread. One such holding house, positioned only a short walk from the river and guarded day and night, became the center of a mystery that would unsettle even those who believed slavery was an unchangeable fact of life. On a humid summer evening, after the last tally of chained captives had been recorded and the guards had settled into their routine, one enslaved man vanished without explanation. His name, age, and physical description were clearly written in the trader's ledger earlier that day, and witnesses confirmed seeing him alive at sunset. By morning, the space where he had slept was empty, his chains neatly coiled on the floor as if they had been unlocked and removed with care rather than broken in desperation. The disappearance immediately troubled the traders, not out of concern for the man's life, but because such an event threatened the illusion of control upon which their business depended. Escapes did happen, but rarely from such secure locations, and never without signs of forced entry, broken restraints, or help from the outside. This holding house had thick walls, no open windows, and a single heavy door that remained locked from dusk until dawn. 2 guards were stationed nearby, both experienced men who swore they had heard nothing unusual throughout the night. No cries, no scuffle, no footfalls fleeing into the dark streets. Even the dogs kept for such emergencies had remained silent. The absence of chaos was, in itself, unsettling. When the guards unlocked the door at dawn, expecting the usual scene of exhausted, fearful captives, they instead found a gap in the human inventory, a silence that felt heavier than any scream. Inside the holding room, everything appeared disturbingly orderly. Straw mats lay undisturbed, chains were intact, and the walls bore no fresh marks. The man's shackles had not been forced open, the iron was unbent, the locks unbroken. To the traders, this suggested either impossible skill or impossible circumstances. Some whispered that the guards must have been bribed or complicit, but both men were known for their loyalty to the trade and had little to gain from risking their positions. Others suspected assistance from free black residents or abolitionist sympathizers, yet no one had been seen entering or leaving the building. The narrow alley behind the house showed no footprints leading away, despite the soft earth from recent rain. It was as if the man had simply ceased to exist between nightfall and morning. As word spread quietly through the port, the enslaved people held in nearby buildings began to murmur among themselves. They spoke in low voices, careful not to draw attention, yet their whispers carried a different tone than ordinary talk of sales and punishments. Some said the man had been deeply withdrawn the day before, staring at the walls as though listening to something no one else could hear. Others claimed he had asked strange questions about the building, about what lay beneath the floorboards and behind the walls. To the traders, such stories were dismissed as nonsense born of fear, but among the enslaved, the disappearance took on a meaning that went beyond escape. It felt unnatural, as though the city itself had swallowed one of its prisoners. The free black dock workers, who moved between ships and warehouses, heard fragments of the story and added their own observations. One man recalled seeing the missing slave earlier that week, being marched through the street with a look not of panic, but of quiet resignation, as if he already knew his fate would not be decided at an auction block. Another claimed he had seen the same man near the river late at night, days before the disappearance, though records showed he should have been locked inside the holding house at that time. Such contradictions made the story more confusing rather than clearer, and soon even those who dismissed superstition felt a growing unease. Alexandria was a place of order and record-keeping, a city that prided itself on commerce and law, yet here was a gap that no ledger could immediately explain. The traders responded as they always did when faced with uncertainty. They tightened control. Guards were questioned harshly, captives were counted repeatedly, and punishments increased to discourage any thoughts of rebellion. Yet this only deepened the sense that something had gone wrong beyond human error. The disappearance did not feel like an act of resistance or clever planning. It felt like an absence, a hole torn quietly into the system. For a society obsessed with ownership, the idea that a person could vanish without trace was deeply disturbing. It suggested that the mechanisms of slavery, so carefully constructed, were not as absolute as their masters believed. As the days passed with no sign of the missing man, the city resumed its routine, but a subtle shift lingered. Traders spoke more cautiously, guards watched shadows longer than usual, and enslaved people exchanged looks heavy with unspoken thoughts. Alexandria in 1835 continued to function as it always had, ships arriving and departing, auctions proceeding on schedule, yet beneath that rhythm lay a quiet question that no one dared to voice openly. If a man could disappear from the heart of the slave trade without breaking a single lock, what else about the system was an illusion? The mystery began not with violence or rebellion, but with silence, and that silence would echo far beyond the walls of one holding house, seeping into the collective memory of a city built on captivity. In the days following the disappearance, the auction house became a place not only of commerce, but of quiet dread, where every sound seemed amplified and every shadow carried meaning. Enslaved people brought in from surrounding counties noticed the change immediately. The usual harsh efficiency of the traders was replaced by irritation and unease, and guards lingered longer than necessary near doorways, their eyes darting as though they expected something unseen to slip past them. It was in this tense atmosphere that whispers began to circulate, carried softly from mouth to mouth among those who had learned that survival often depended on speaking without being heard. The whispers did not follow a single version of events. Instead, they multiplied, each retelling shaped by fear, memory, and the need to make sense of some thing that defied the brutal logic of slavery. Some said the missing man had been taken by abolitionists using secret routes beneath the city, while others insisted no human hands were involved at all. Late at night, after the day's auctions had ended and the iron doors were bolted shut, certain captives claimed they heard the faint sound of chains moving across the floor, slow and deliberate, as though someone were walking just beyond sight. The noise was not frantic or violent, but steady, almost patient, and it seemed to come from different corners of the building each time. A woman held near the back of the auction house whispered that she heard a low voice calling a name she did not recognize, repeating it again and again until the sound dissolved into silence. Another man swore he saw a figure standing near the auction block at dawn, head bowed, body motionless, only to blink and find the space empty. These stories were shared cautiously, always with a glance toward the guards, yet they spread quickly because they resonated with a shared sense of unease. For the traders, rumors were dangerous not because they believed them, but because enslaved people did. Fear, when mixed with hope or mystery, could undermine control, and so the traders dismissed the whispers as tricks of the mind brought on by hunger and exhaustion. Publicly, they laughed at the idea of ghosts or hidden passages, insisting that the disappearance would soon be explained as a simple escape or clerical error. Privately, however, even some of them felt unsettled. One trader reportedly refused to walk alone through the auction house after dark, claiming the air felt heavy as though the building itself were watching him. Another insisted on recounting the captives multiple times each night, unable to shake the fear that another person might vanish without warning. Among the enslaved, the wisp RS took on deeper meaning. In a world where their lives were defined by ownership and transaction, the idea that someone could appear and disappear without permission challenged everything they had been forced to accept. Some began to speak of the missing man as if he were no longer bound by the laws that governed them, as if he had crossed into a space beyond chains and ledgers. Older captives, who carried memories of African spiritual traditions passed down through generations, suggested that certain places held power, especially places soaked in suffering. They spoke of restless spirits and thresholds between worlds, careful to frame their words as metaphor rather than belief, yet the implication lingered. The auction house, with its cries, its broken families, and its blood-stained floors, was exactly the kind of place where the past refused to stay silent. Free black residents of Alexandria added another layer to the mystery. Dock workers, sailors, and laborers who moved through the city heard fragments of the story and began sharing their own observations. One dockhand claimed he saw the missing man days after his disappearance, standing near the edge of the river at night, staring into the water as if searching for something. When the dockhand called out, the figure turned, and for a brief moment their eyes met. The man described the look as hollow yet calm, neither desperate nor afraid, before the figure stepped back into the darkness and vanished. Another free black woman insisted she heard footsteps pacing outside her home near the auction house long after midnight, followed by the faint sound of iron scraping stone. When she opened her door, the street was empty, but the sense of being watched lingered. White residents, though largely insulated from the daily realities of slavery, could not completely escape the rumors. Alexandria was a compact city, and news travelled quickly along tavern counters and market stalls. Some laughed off the stories as slave superstition, a convenient way to avoid admitting that their carefully guarded system had flaws. Others, particularly those who relied on the slave trade for income, felt a creeping anxiety that something was unraveling beneath their feet. A local newspaper briefly mentioned the disappearance, framing it as an escape and warning traders to be more vigilant. But the article failed to quiet the speculation. Instead, it seemed to legitimize the idea that something unusual had occurred, something worth talking about. The auction house itself seemed to take on a new character in the public imagination. Once merely a place of transaction, it became a symbol of unanswered questions. Enslaved people brought there for sale looked at the walls differently, noticing cracks and dark corners that had once blended into the background. Some claimed the building felt colder at night, even during the height of summer, while others said the air grew thick and hard to breathe after sunset. Whether these sensations were real or imagined mattered little. They shaped behavior and belief in ways the traders could not fully control. Fear is contagious, and in a place already saturated with suffering, it spread quickly. As the whispers grew, so did the attempts to suppress them. Guards were instructed to punish anyone caught speaking of the disappearance after dark, and captives were threatened with sale farther south if they continued spreading lies. Yet suppression only drove the stories deeper underground, where they evolved beyond the reach of authority. The missing man was no longer just a person, he became a presence, a symbol of something unresolved. Some spoke of him as a warning, others as a promise, but nearly all agreed on one thing: the system that claimed absolute power over their bodies had failed, if only once, and that failure mattered. Even those who rejected supernatural explanations could not ignore the inconsistencies. If the man had escaped, why had no one seen him flee? If he had been helped, why were there no signs of entry or exit? And if the ledgers were correct, how could a person exist on paper without existing in flesh? These questions circulated alongside the whispers, feeding them rather than silencing them. The more authorities insisted there was nothing to fear, the more people sensed that fear was exactly what they were trying to hide. By the time weeks had passed, the whispers had woven themselves into the fabric of Alexandria's slave-era life. They were no longer confined to the auction house, but echoed through kitchens, docks, and back alleys, reshaping how people understood the disappearance. What began as quiet murmurs among the enslaved had grown into a shared unease that crossed racial and social boundaries, challenging the assumption that everything could be accounted for, controlled, and owned. The missing man's absence spoke louder than his presence ever could, and in the echo of that absence, Alexandria confronted a truth it was not ready to face: that even the most rigid systems can be haunted by what they fail to contain. As officials attempted to restore order and reassure traders that nothing extraordinary had occurred, attention inevitably turned to the ledgers, those thick leather-bound books that were treated as the ultimate authority on human ownership. In Alexandria, A person's existence within the slave system was defined not by breath or blood, but by ink on a page. Names, ages, heights, scars, and prices were carefully recorded, creating the illusion that every life could be tracked, measured, and controlled. When the disappearance could not be explained through guards or physical evidence, clerks were instructed to review the records, confident that the truth would emerge from the pages. What they found instead unsettled even the most hardened traders. The missing man's name appeared exactly where it should have been, listed as part of a recent shipment from inland Virginia, complete with a purchase price and a brief physical description. Yet as clerks traced his entry forward through the book, they discovered something deeply strange. His name did not end with the expected notation of sale and removal from inventory. Instead, it appeared again days later, recorded as sold to a buyer bound for Mississippi, and then again the following week, listed as transferred to another trader entirely. At first, this was assumed to be a simple clerical error, the kind that occurred when exhausted men copied figures late into the night. Slavery depended on bureaucracy, but bureaucracy was run by fallible humans. Still, as the review continued, the pattern grew harder to dismiss. Each entry was written in a different hand, as though multiple clerks had independently recorded the same man's sale. Each sale was marked as completed, paid in full, and finalized according to procedure. Most disturbing of all, when the supposed buyers were questioned, every one of them denied ever receiving the man. They remembered the transaction clearly, remembered counting out the money, remembered signing their names, yet when pressed to describe the enslaved person they had purchased, their recollections grew vague or contradictory. Some admitted they had never laid eyes on him at all, that the sale had been conducted through paperwork and intermediaries, as if the body itself had been unnecessary. The idea that a person could be bought and sold multiple times without ever physically changing hands exposed a flaw at the heart of the system. Slavery relied on the belief that ownership was absolute and tangible, yet here was evidence suggesting that ownership could exist only on paper. Traders began to argue among themselves, accusing one another of fraud or deliberate deception. Some suspected an elaborate scheme in which a missing slave was being resold repeatedly to inflate profits. Yet no one could explain who was benefiting or how such a scheme could function without a physical person to deliver. Others suggested that the man had died and that his death was being concealed to avoid financial loss. But this theory collapsed when no body could be produced, and no record of illness or punishment appeared in the logs. As the ledger review expanded, additional inconsistencies emerged. Dates did not align, locations overlapped, and notes in the margins hinted at confusion even at the time of writing. One clerk had scribbled a question mark beside the man's name, while another had underlined it twice, as though trying to draw attention to something he did not fully understand. These markings suggested that the problem had not been discovered all at once, but had been unfolding quietly, noticed and then ignored by individuals who lacked the authority or courage to challenge the system. In a world where questioning records meant questioning ownership, silence was often safer than truth. The bureaucratic confusion soon took on a psychological weight. Traders who had once trusted their ledgers implicitly began to doubt them, flipping pages late into the night, searching for reassurance that other names remained stable and singular. Guards wondered whether they were protecting people or just words written in ink. Even clerks, whose job it was to transform human lives into entries, felt a growing unease. If a man could exist multiple times on paper without existing anywhere in the flesh, what did that say about the reality they were enforcing every day? The ledgers, once symbols of order, began to feel like instruments of delusion, creating a version of reality that could drift away from the physical world without warning. Among the enslaved, news of the ledger irregularities spread in fragments, carried by overheard conversations and the rare careless remark from a clerk. To them, the idea that the system could not even keep its own records straight was both frightening and strangely validating. They had always known in their bones that the rules governing their lives were arbitrary and cruel, but seeing those rules break down on paper suggested a deeper instability. Some whispered that the missing man had slipped between the lines of the book, escaping not through doors or windows, but through the cracks in the system itself. Others feared that if a man could be sold without being present, then they too might be moved, punished, or erased without warning, reduced entirely to entries that could be altered at will. Authorities attempted to resolve the matter through quiet adjustments. Entries were crossed out, rewritten, and consolidated in an effort to restore a single coherent narrative. Yet each correction raised new questions. Which sale had been real? Which buyer, if any, had rightful claim? And how could a claim exist without a body to assert it over? The more they tried to fix the problem, the more apparent it became that the ledgers were not neutral records, but active participants in the violence of slavery. They did not merely reflect reality, they shaped it, sometimes create outcomes that no one had consciously chosen. The mystery deepened when a senior clerk, known for his meticulous habits, privately admitted that he had never actually seen the missing man, despite recording his details. He claimed the information had been provided to him by another trader, who in turn insisted he had received it from a third party. The chain of responsibility stretched backward until it dissolved into uncertainty, revealing that the man's documented existence rested on layers of assumption rather than direct observation. In a system that claimed to know and control every body, this was a dangerous revelation. It suggested that people could be reduced to abstractions, traded and transferred as concepts rather than living beings, making disappearance not an anomaly but an inevitable consequence. As weeks passed, the ledger issue became less a problem to be solved and more a secret to be contained. Traders feared that public knowledge of such inconsistencies would undermine confidence in the market, inviting scrutiny from critics and abolitionists eager to expose the trade's moral and logistical failures. Officials quietly discouraged further investigation, framing the irregularities as routine errors exaggerated by rumor. Yet the damage was done. The ledgers no longer felt like anchors of certainty, but like unstable ground, shifting beneath the weight of their own contradictions. In private moments, some traders reportedly confessed to a creeping sense of guilt they could not fully articulate. Not guilt for participating in slavery, which they had long justified, but guilt for believing that paperwork could capture and command human lives. The missing man, whether alive or dead, had exposed the hollowness of that belief. He had become a presence defined not by chains or confinement, but by absence and repetition, appearing again and again in ink remaining unreachable in reality. His name haunted the pages, a reminder that the system's greatest strength, its meticulous record-keeping, was also its greatest weakness. By the time the authorities declared the matter resolved, consolidating the entries into a single ambiguous note, no one truly believed the explanation. The ledger had failed to produce clarity, offering instead a mirror that reflected the moral chaos at the heart of Alexandria's slave trade. A man had vanished, yet his name lived on, multiplying across pages that claimed to own him. In trying to reduce a human life to a commodity, the system had created a paradox it could not escape: ownership without possession, sale without substance, and a mystery written not in blood or bone, but in ink that refused to tell a single stable truth. As suspicion deepened and explanations collapsed under their own weight, attention slowly drifted away from the ledgers and toward a structure that most people in Alexandria preferred not to think about at all. Near the river, just far enough from the busiest docks to avoid constant attention, stood an abandoned brick house that had once belonged to a slave trader known for his cruelty and secrecy. The man had died years earlier, leaving no heirs willing to claim the property, and since then the building had remained locked, its windows boarded and its doors sealed. Locals passed it without looking, sailors crossed the street to avoid its shadow at night, and enslaved people whispered warnings about it to one another. It was said that the house had never truly been empty, that it held on to what had happened inside its walls long after the last footsteps faded. When officials began searching for answers to the disappearance, the house emerged not through evidence, but through fear, spoken of reluctantly, as though naming it might invite consequences. The first purrs. On to suggest searching the house was a junior official who had grown frustrated with the lack of progress. He argued that the tunnels rumored to run beneath older buildings near the river could explain how someone vanished without breaking locks. The idea was initially dismissed as fanciful, yet it lingered, fueled by dock workers who claimed that parts of the riverbank had collapsed over the years, revealing bricked-up passages beneath the city. Alexandria, like many old port towns, was built in layers, each generation stacking its structures atop the remnants of the last. What lay beneath was poorly mapped and largely forgotten, making it an ideal hiding place for secrets. Reluctantly, a small group of officials agreed to inspect the abandoned house, though none volunteered eagerly. When they finally forced entry, the air inside was stale and heavy, carrying the smell of damp brick and old iron. Dust coated every surface, yet certain areas appeared strangely disturbed, as if something had been moved recently despite the building's long abandonment. The main room bore faint stains on the floorboards, dark patches that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully erase. Rusted shackles were bolted into the walls, their placement suggesting prolonged confinement rather than temporary restraint. This was not merely a storage space or office, it was a place designed for control and suffering. Even hardened men accustomed to the realities of slavery felt an instinctive discomfort standing there, as though they had stepped into a room that remembered too much. As they explored further, they discovered a trap-door concealed beneath warped planks near the back of the house. It was cleverly hidden, the wood cut and fitted so precisely that it blended into the floor when closed. Opening it revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The officials hesitated, lanterns held low, aware that whatever lay below had been intentionally kept out of sight. When they descended, they found a network of low tunnels running toward the river, their brick walls damp and uneven. Some passages had collapsed, while others stretched farther than expected, branching in ways that suggested careful planning rather than haphazard construction. These tunnels, it seemed, had been built not for escape but for concealment. Within the tunnels, they found more signs of human presence, broken chains, scraps of cloth, and marks on the walls where fingers had clawed in desperation. Yet there were no bodies, no bones, nothing that could conclusively explain the missing man's fate. The absence was as unsettling as the discovery itself. It suggested that whatever purpose the tunnels had served, they had been emptied deliberately. The officials could not determine when the tunnels were last used, but the signs did not look decades old. Someone or something had been there more recently than anyone was comfortable admitting. News of the discovery spread quickly, despite attempts to keep it quiet. Among enslaved people, the abandoned house became a focal point for whispered stories that grew darker with each retelling. Some claimed the trader who once owned the house had used the tunnels to punish slaves away from public view, making them disappear without record. Others believed the house was cursed, that the suffering inflicted there had left an imprint that continued to draw people into its depths. A few whispered that the missing man had been taken there not by force, but by something calling to him, something that promised an end to his suffering while delivering something far more unknowable. White residents reacted with a mixture of denial and fascination. Taverns buzzed with speculation, some insisting the tunnels proved a criminal conspiracy, others arguing the discovery should be forgotten for the good of the city's reputation. Alexandria depended on trade, and trade depended on trust. The idea that people could vanish into hidden spaces beneath the city threatened that trust in ways that went beyond a single disappearance. It raised questions about how much of the city's wealth was built on acts deliberately hidden from view. Officials returned to the house several times, mapping the tunnels as best they could, yet each visit seemed to yield more questions than answers. Some passages appeared to end abruptly in solid brick, as though sealed intentionally. Others curved toward the river, stopping just short of the waterline. One tunnel, narrower than the rest, bore scratches along its ceiling and walls, marks that suggested repeated movement rather than a single desperate attempt to escape. It was as if someone had walked those tunnels many times, familiar with their twists and dead ends. Despite these discoveries, the investigation stalled. No direct evidence linked the house to the missing man, and no witness could place him there definitively. Still, the sense that the house was connected to the mystery refused to fade. Guards reported feeling watched when stationed nearby at night. A sailor claimed he heard footsteps beneath the street while passing the property after dark. Enslaved people held nearby insisted that the air changed when the wind blew from the river, carrying with it faint sounds that did not belong to the living. Whether these experiences were born of fear or something else entirely, they reinforced the house's reputation as a place where the boundaries between past and present felt dangerously thin. Ultimately, higher authorities intervened, concerned less with solving the mystery than with containing it. The house was ordered sealed once more, its entrance bricked up and guarded temporarily to discourage curiosity. Official reports described the tunnels as remnants of old storage cellars, their condition exaggerated by rumor and imagination. The stains, the shackles, the scratches were acknowledged only vaguely, stripped of context and meaning. In doing so, the authorities hoped to bury the questions along with the building itself. Yet sealing the house did not erase its presence from the city's consciousness. If anything, it intensified it. The abandoned structure became a symbol of everything that could not be openly discussed, a physical reminder that Alexandria's prosperity rested on hidden foundations. The missing man's fate remained unresolved, but the house offered a grim possibility that he had not escaped the system but been absorbed by its darkest spaces, where accountability dissolved and suffering left no official trace. For those forced to live within that system, the house represented both terror and truth. It embodied the knowledge that cruelty was not accidental but engineered, built into walls and passageways designed to hide it. Whether the missing man had passed through those tunnels or not, the discovery confirmed what many already knew, that there were places where people went and were never meant to return, places that existed precisely so their stories would never be told. And though the doors were sealed and the tunnels forgotten once more, the house remained, silent and watchful, holding its secrets close while the mystery of Alexandria's vanished slave deepened into something far more unsettling than a single unexplained absence. The decision to end the investigation did not come with an announcement or a sense of closure, but rather with a quiet tightening of control that many in Alexandria recognized immediately, even if they could not openly name it. Orders filtered down through official channels, couched in language about efficiency and public order, instructing clerks to stop revisiting the ledgers and guards to cease informal questioning. What had once been a matter of concern became, almost overnight, an inconvenience best forgotten. Files related to the disappearance were gathered and relocated to offices few people visited, and certain pages of the ledgers were amended with vague notes that offered the appearance of resolution without answering any of the questions that had sparked the inquiry. In public, authorities declared the matter closed, attributing the confusion to minor errors and exaggeration. In private, the silence felt heavy, as though something unfinished had been deliberately pressed beneath the surface. Witnesses who had spoken too freely found themselves removed from the city in subtle but effective ways. Enslaved people who had claimed to hear or see strange things were sold south with unusual speed, their absence justified as routine transactions. Free black dock workers who had repeated stories too openly discovered that work dried up or that they were suddenly under scrutiny for unrelated offenses. Even a few white clerks and guards who had expressed doubts were reassigned or encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. The message was clear without ever being stated outright. This was not a mystery that Alexandria wished to solve. The cost of pursuing the truth had become higher than the cost of living with unanswered questions. The abandoned house near the river, briefly thrust into the spotlight, was sealed again, its doors bricked shut and its windows reinforced. Officially, it was declared unsafe and off-limits, a hazard rather than a site of interest. Guards were posted for a short time, not to protect the public but to discourage curiosity, and once attention waned, even those guards were withdrawn. The building returned to its previous state of quiet neglect, though its reputation had changed irrevocably. People still avoided it, but now they did so with a sharper sense of purpose, as if the city itself had decided that some places were better left untouched, Among traders and officials, an uneasy consensus formed. They would treat the disappearance as an anomaly, a statistical outlier in an otherwise orderly system. By framing it as an exception, they could preserve their faith in the machinery of slavery and the records that supported it. Yet that faith had been cracked. In moments of solitude, some found themselves replaying the sequence of events, unable to reconcile the idea of a man who had vanished without resistance or trace. The ledgers no longer felt as solid as they once had, and a few traders quietly altered their practices, insisting on physical confirmation of every transaction. The SE changes were never discussed openly, but they reflected a lingering fear that paper alone could no longer guarantee control. For the enslaved, the silencing of the investigation did not erase the story, it transformed it. The missing man became a figure spoken of in hushed tones, his fate interpreted in ways that offered meaning where official narratives offered none. To some, he represented the ultimate cruelty of the system, a man erased so completely that even his suffering left no official record. To others, he symbolized a rare and fragile kind of victory, someone who had slipped beyond the reach of chains and commerce, even if the cost of that escape was unknown. Stories evolved over time, shaped by memory and need, until the man was less an individual and more a presence woven into the collective consciousness. Children growing up in bondage heard fragments of the tale from elders who framed it as a warning or a lesson. They spoke of how the system could consume people without acknowledgement and of how silence could be as powerful as violence. In these retellings, the missing man was not always nameless. Sometimes he was given a name borrowed from a relative or ancestor, a way of anchoring the story in personal experience. Through these acts of remembrance, the enslaved resisted the erasure imposed by the authorities, keeping alive a truth that official records had tried to bury. Free black residents carried the story differently, often sharing it in private gatherings where trust allowed for honesty. For them, the mystery underscored the precariousness of their own position, reminding them that even freedom offered no protection from a system willing to look away. The disappearance became a point of quiet solidarity, a shared reference that bound people together through understanding rather than proof. They did not need to agree on what had happened to. Recognize that something profoundly wrong had occurred. White residents too were affected, though many would never admit it. The case lingered at the edges of their thoughts, resurfacing during moments of doubt or moral unease. Some dismissed it entirely, convincing themselves that the city had done what was necessary to maintain order. Others felt a faint, persistent discomfort, a sense that the prosperity they enjoyed rested on foundations far less stable than they had believed. The disappearance challenged the comforting narrative that slavery was a manageable, regulated institution, revealing instead a system capable of producing mysteries it could neither explain nor acknowledge. As years passed, the immediate details blurred, but the core of the story endured. New generations encountered it not as a current event, but as a piece of local lore, something spoken of with a mix of curiosity and reverence. The abandoned house remained a landmark, its sealed doors a physical reminder of unresolved history. The ledgers, amended and refiled, continued to exist in archives, their inconsistencies overlooked by those who preferred not to read too closely. Officially, the case was resolved. Unofficially, it was never closed. The silencing of the investigation revealed as much about Alexandria as the mystery itself. It demonstrated how power operated not only through force, but through omission, through the deliberate narrowing of what could be questioned. By declaring the matter finished, authorities asserted control over the narrative, even as they failed to control the truth. The missing man's story exposed the limits of that control, showing that some absences could not be filled with words or paperwork. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the case was not the disappearance, but the city's response to it. Alexandria chose stability over truth, order over understanding, and in doing so it ensured that the mystery would persist. The man who vanished in 1835 remained absent in body but present in memory, a reminder that systems built on dehumanization inevitably produce secrets they cannot contain. His story survived not because it was recorded accurately, but because it was felt deeply, passed down through whispers that outlasted official silence. Long after the investigation faded from public view, the echoes of that silence continued to shape how people understood the past. The mystery became a lens through which later generations would question the narratives handed down to them, prompting a deeper examination of what was remembered and what was erased. In this way, the case was never truly silenced. It lingered in the spaces between records, in the gaps where certainty dissolved, and in the enduring discomfort of a city that had chosen not to look too closely at one of its own darkest moments.